My name is Max. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 10 years. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that night. It was late October, and the leaves were turning gold and red. The nights were getting colder, and I had a load to deliver. I picked up a shipment of electronics in Chicago, heading to a small town in Oregon. I was excited because I loved driving through the mountains. There's something peaceful about it, especially when the sun set. I hit the road around 6 p.m., planning to drive straight through the night. I had my favorite playlist ready, and the truck was in good shape. As I cruised down the highway, the night was calm. The stars twinkled above me, and the moon lit up the road. I felt good, but I knew I needed to keep my eyes open. Long-haul driving can be dangerous, especially at night. A few hours in, I stopped at a rest area to stretch my legs and grab some coffee. The vending machine was old, but it had my favorite energy drink. I leaned against my truck, sipping my drink and looking around. The area was empty, just me, the quiet night, and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. After a short break, I got back in my truck and continued driving. The road was long and lonely, but I was used to it. I drove through the woods, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The headlights of my truck cut through the darkness, but I still felt a chill run down my spine. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know something isn't right. Around midnight, I saw a flickering light off the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a campfire, but as I got closer, I realized it was a small old diner. The sign said, "Open 24 hours." I hadn't seen anything like it for miles, so I decided to stop and grab a bite. As I walked inside, the bell above the door jingled softly. The diner was dimly lit and empty except for one waitress behind the counter. She looked up and smiled, but there was something strange about her smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome, what can I get you?" she asked. "Just a coffee and a burger, please," I replied, trying to shake off the unease. She turned to the grill, cooking my order. I took a seat at the counter and looked around. The walls were filled with old photos and faded newspaper clippings, but one photo caught my attention. It showed a group of people standing in front of the diner, but something about their faces seemed off. They looked too happy, almost like they were forced to smile. "Here you go," the waitress said, placing my food in front of me. Thanks," I mumbled, trying to ignore the weird feeling creeping back. I took a bite of the burger, and it was surprisingly good. The coffee was hot and strong, which I needed. As I ate, I noticed the waitress watching me from the corner of her eye. It felt like she was waiting for something. I glanced around the diner, trying to see if anyone else would come in, but it was just us. Do you get many customers out here?" I asked, trying to make small talk. Not really," she said, her smile fading a little. "Most people just drive by. It's nice to have someone here." I nodded, feeling a little uncomfortable. I finished my meal quickly, wanting to get back on the road. As I reached for my wallet, I noticed something strange in the corner of my eye. A shadow moved outside the window. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Are you okay?" the waitress asked, her voice soft and almost concerned. "Yeah, just thought I saw something," I replied, shaking my head. "Must be the coffee." After paying and thanking her, I stepped outside. The cold night air hit me and I felt a shiver run down my spine. As I climbed back into my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, trying to forget the strange diner and the even stranger waitress. The road stretched out before me, and the night seemed to close in around me again. About an hour later, I was driving through a thick forest. The trees towered above me, and the darkness felt heavier. I turned up the radio, hoping to distract myself, but the static filled the cab. I fiddled with the knobs, but the radio wouldn't clear up. Just then, my headlights caught something in the road ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the highway. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just in time. It was a man, wearing a tattered jacket and jeans. His hair was long and unkempt, and he looked disoriented. I rolled down my window, feeling a mix of fear and concern. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. He stared at me, his eyes wide and glassy. "Help me," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened?" I asked. But before he could answer, he turned and ran off into the woods. My heart raced as I watched him disappear into the darkness. I knew I should have driven away, but something compelled me to get out. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the road, shining the beam into the tree. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. "Are you okay?" There was no answer, just the rustle of leaves. I took a few cautious steps into the woods, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity pushed me forward. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a low growl coming from deeper in the woods. I froze, heart pounding. The growl turned into a howl, echoing through the trees. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run back to my truck. As I stumbled through the underbrush, I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. My breath caught in my throat. It was a wolf, and it was not alone. More wolves emerged from the shadows surrounding me. They snarled and growled, their teeth bared. I felt trapped, my heart racing as I looked for a way out. Just when I thought I was done for, I heard a loud horn blaring from the road. The wolves froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. I took the chance and bolted back toward my truck. I leaped inside and slammed the door shut, locking it. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the keys, heart racing. I looked up to see the wolves watching me from the edge of the trees. They were waiting, their eyes glowing in the dark. I turned on the engine, the sound of the truck revving cutting through the tension. As I pulled away, I could feel their gaze on me, a chill creeping up my spine. I glanced in the rearview mirror and they were still there, watching until I was out of sight. I didn't stop again after that. I drove straight through the night, my heart still racing from the encounter. The road was empty, and the silence felt heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Around dawn, I finally reached a small town. I pulled into a gas station, needing to fill up and take a breath. As I got out, I noticed a group of locals standing by the pumps, talking in hushed voices. They stopped when they saw me, their eyes wide. I approached them, trying to shake off the unease. "What's going on?" I asked, hoping for some normalcy. One of the men stepped forward, his face pale. "Did you see it?" he asked, voice trembling. "The thing in the woods?" "What thing?" I replied, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The wolves," he said, looking around nervously. "They've been acting strange lately. We've lost a few people." My heart sank as I recalled the man I saw on the road, the way he begged for help. "What do you mean lost?" I asked, feeling sick. "They disappear," he said, voice low. "No one knows why, but it's like they're drawn to the forest. People go in and they never come out." I turned to look at the woods in the distance, the dark trees looming over us. "What happened to the man I saw?" I asked, panic rising. The locals exchanged worried glances. "No one knows. If you see him again, don't help, just drive away," the man warned. "They're not what they say." I nodded, fear flooding my mind. I filled up my tank quickly, ready to get out of town. I climbed back into my truck, hands shaking. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the woods. The sun rose higher, but the unease lingered. I turned up the radio trying to distract myself, but it was still filled with static. I fiddled with the knobs again, but nothing worked. Hours passed, and I finally hit the highway that would take me to Oregon. I felt a little better, but the memory of that night haunted me. I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see glowing eyes following me. As I approached a small town, I decided to stop for food. I parked at a diner that looked welcoming and clean. When I walked in, I felt relieved to see other customers. I sat at the counter and ordered a sandwich, trying to relax. As I waited, I overheard two men talking at a nearby table. They were discussing the strange happenings in the woods. "Did you hear about the guy who disappeared last week?" one of them said. "They say he saw something in the forest and went after." I leaned in, curious. "What did he see?" I asked. "They don't know. But they found his truck abandoned on the side of the road," the man replied. "The wolves have been restless lately." My stomach turned. I was starting to connect the dots. The man in the road, the diner, the wolves, it was all linked somehow. I finished my meal quickly, eager to leave. As I got up to pay, the waitress smiled at me, but her smile felt forced. "Have a safe trip," she said, her voice sweet but empty. I nodded. paying the bill and heading back to my truck. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I felt the chill of the night creeping in again. As I climbed into my truck, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was the same man I had seen before. My heart raced, and I froze. He looked different this time, wilder, more disheveled. He was staring at me, his eyes full of desperation. "Help me!" he shouted, but it wasn't the same voice. It sounded distorted, like something was wrong. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding. I started the engine, my hands trembling. I couldn't let him in. I couldn't trust him. I backed out of the parking lot, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. As I drove away, I looked back one last time. The man was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the trees. I didn't stop again until I reached the Oregon border. I pulled into a truck stop, desperate for a break. I parked and climbed out, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. I walked into the stop and ordered a coffee. The place was filled with truckers and travelers, and for a moment I felt safe. I sat down at a table, trying to shake off the tension. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard a group of truckers talking about the woods. "You hear about the disappearances?" one of them said. "It's been happening for years." "What do you mean?" I leaned in, curiosity piqued. "They say there's something in the forest," another trucker replied, looking around cautiously. "People go in and never come back. It's like the woods call to them." My heart sank again as I thought of the man and the wolves. "What kind of thing?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. No one answered, but I could see the fear in their eyes. The stories swirled around me, growing darker with each word. I knew I had to leave. After finishing my coffee, I climbed back into my truck and hit the road again. The sun had set, and the night stretched out before me, dark and foreboding. I drove for hours, my mind racing with thoughts of the diner, the man, and the wolves. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I felt the familiar chill settle over me. I pulled into a rest area, hoping for a moment of peace. The parking lot was empty, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I parked my truck and climbed out, stretching my legs. The air was cold, and the silence felt heavy. I walked around the lot, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. As I turned to head back, I saw something in the distance, a flicker of light. My heart raced as I recognized it. It was the same diner from before. Against my better judgment, I felt drawn to it. I walked toward the light, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I approached, I noticed the old sign swaying in the wind, creaking like it hadn't been touched in years. The bell jingled softly as I stepped inside. The diner was empty, just as I had left it. The waitress stood behind the counter, her smile wide and eerie. "Welcome back," she said, her voice cheerful but hollow. "Did you come for more food?" No, just passing through," I said, feeling uneasy. She nodded, but her eyes darkened for a moment. "You shouldn't be out here at night. It's dangerous." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. "I'll be leaving soon," I said, taking a step back toward the door. But as I turned to leave, I heard a low growl coming from the back of the diner. My heart raced, and I froze. The waitress's smile faded, replaced by a strange look in her eyes. "Stay here," she said, her voice turning cold. "You'll be safe." I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run. "No, I need to go," I shouted, but she stepped closer, blocking my way. Just then, the growling grew louder, echoing through the diner. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I pushed past her and bolted for the door, heart racing. As I ran outside, I saw shadows moving in the trees. The wolves were back, their eyes glowing in the darkness. I scrambled into my truck, locking the door behind me. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered. "Come on," I shouted, panic rising. I tried again, and this time the engine roared to life. I backed out of the parking lot and hit the gas, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't look back as I sped down the road, the growls echoing behind me. I drove as fast as I could, the night stretching out before me. My heart raced, and fear surged through me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. After a long drive, I finally reached a small town and pulled into a motel. I needed to rest, to escape the nightmare of the night. As I walked to the office, I glanced back at my truck, feeling a sense of unease. The clerk behind the counter greeted me with a smile, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "You look like you've had a long night," she said. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied, trying to sound casual. As I signed in, I noticed a newspaper on the counter. The headline read, "Disappearance in the Woods." My heart sank as I read the details. A man had gone missing, last seen near the dock. I paid for my room and headed down the dimly lit hallway. My heart raced as I felt the weight of the night pressing down on me. I opened the door to my room and stepped inside, locking it behind me. I sat on the bed, trying to calm down. I couldn't believe what had happened. I felt like I was losing my mind. After a while, I lay down, hoping to get some sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the woods, the wolves, and the waitress with her strange smile. Hours passed, and I finally drifted off, but sleep was restless. I dreamt of the diner, the shadows, and the glowing eyes. When I woke up, the sun was shining through the window. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe it was just a bad dream. I got up and showered, trying to shake off the lingering fear. After getting dressed, I decided to leave town and head for my delivery. I packed my things and headed to the parking lot. As I stepped outside, I felt the chill of the morning air. I walked to my truck, but something caught my eye. There, on the ground, was a small piece of paper. I picked it up and read it. "Don't go into the woods." My heart raced as I looked around. No one was in sight. I climbed into my truck, feeling a sense of dread. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The road stretched out before me, but the memories of the night haunted me. Finally, I reached the town where I was supposed to deliver the load. I parked outside a small warehouse and stepped out of the truck, feeling the weight of the night still clinging to me. As I walked inside, the smell of fresh paint filled the air. A man greeted me, his smile warm and friendly. "You made it. We were worried about you." "Yeah, long night," I said, trying to smile back. He looked at me closely, his expression shifting. "You're not the first trucker to come through here. Some say they see things in the woods. Just be careful." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "I will," I promised. After dropping off the load, I headed back to my truck, eager to leave the town behind. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The town faded into the distance, but the memories of that night would stay with me forever. I drove for hours, the sun setting behind me. The woods loomed in the distance, but I didn't look back. I knew I had to keep moving, to escape the horrors of the night. As I reached the next highway, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but deep down, I knew I wouldn't forget what I had seen, what I had heard. The woods were alive, calling to me, and I could still hear the wolves in the distance. I promised myself I would never return. But as I drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was waiting, watching, and that it would always be a part of me. I had been driving trucks for almost 20 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. But that night, on Route 56, something happened that I'll never forget. It was a job like any other, driving a long route with a trailer full of goods that needed delivering by morning. The only catch? I had to drive through a 100-mile stretch of road with nothing but darkness around. The road had a reputation among truckers. Some said they'd seen strange lights out there. Others spoke of ghostly figures and whispered voices in the night. They called it the long dark because out here, the night felt endless. But I wasn't the superstitious type, and I had bills to pay. So, I took the job and set out with my truck, thinking it would be just another night on the road. The night was thick and heavy, darker than any night I'd ever seen. I had my high beams on, but even then, the road seemed to vanish into the blackness ahead. The hum of the engine was the only sound, steady and strong, but in that silence, even it felt eerie. I tried to turn on the radio, hoping to find some music or even talk radio to keep me company, but all I got was static. About an hour into the drive, something odd caught my eye. A small figure was standing by the side of the road. I couldn't make out much, a dark shape, small and hunched. As I got closer, my headlights lit up a pale face. It looked like a person, but thin, almost like they hadn't eaten in days. They stared straight at me, not waving for help or moving at all. Just staring. I didn't stop. I don't know why, but something about that figure made my stomach twist. I kept my eyes forward and pressed on. But 15 minutes later, I saw them again. Same side of the road, same hunched figure, staring as I drove past. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen any other cars, and there were no turns or exits out here. How could they have gotten ahead of me? I tapped the brakes, thinking maybe I should stop and see if they needed help. But as I slowed down, a feeling washed over me, like a warning. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and every nerve in my body told me to keep going. So I did. I kept my foot on the gas and tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind was racing. Was it just someone out there on their own, or was it something else? Then out of nowhere, the radio crackled. Static buzzed loudly, then faded, and a low voice came through. Honk. It stretched out my name in a slow, almost whispery tone. My heart nearly stopped. No one should know my name out here. I turned the radio off and kept my focus on the road, but I could still feel something watching me, even though I didn't see anyone else around. The road felt longer than it should have, stretching out into the night. I kept checking my mirrors, but there was nothing behind me. No headlights, no cars, just the empty black road. About an hour later, I saw a figure up ahead again. This time, they weren't just standing on the side of the road. They were walking, stumbling along the shoulder, one hand stretched out like they were trying to flag me down. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down the window a crack as I got closer. "Hey," I called out. "Need some help?" The figure stopped and looked up. It was a man, maybe in his 20s, with scruffy clothes and a worn-out look on his face. He didn't seem like much of a threat, but there was something off about him, like he was in a trance. "Please," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Can you give me a ride?" I hesitated. Everything in me said this was a bad idea, but I couldn't leave him out here in the dark. I reached over and unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in slowly, his movements stiff, almost robotic. He didn't say a word as he sat down and buckled up. What's your name?" I asked, trying to break the silence. He stared straight ahead, not looking at me. "Doesn't matter." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the steady rumble of the truck's engine. Finally, he turned his head slightly and said, "You shouldn't have stopped." I felt a chill go down my spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the window, his eyes wide, like he was seeing something terrifying just beyond the glass. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing out there, just darkness. "You shouldn't be out here," he said softly. "Not on this road, not at night." "Why not?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. He didn't respond, just shook his head and whispered, "They're watching." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't want to ask. There was something about his voice, the way he seemed so afraid, that made my stomach twist. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the road ahead, but his words kept echoing in my head. "They're watching." After about 30 minutes, the man suddenly leaned forward, his face pale and sweaty. "Stop the truck," he said, his voice urgent. "Please, you have to stop." I pulled over, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. As soon as we stopped, he opened the door and jumped out, running down the road like he was being chased. I watched him go, confused and more than a little scared. I thought about driving away, but something made me get out and follow him. He didn't get far. About 20 feet down the road, he stopped, staring at something in the distance. I followed his gaze and saw nothing, just more road and darkness. But he looked terrified, like he was staring at something horrible. "What do you see?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "They're coming," he said. "They always come. They'll never let you." I didn't understand, but the fear in his voice made me back up. "Look, maybe you should get back in the truck," I said, trying to stay calm. "We'll drive until we find help." He turned to me, his eyes wide and desperate. "There's no help out here. Not for us. They'll take you too. They always do." Before I could say anything, a low rumble filled the air. It wasn't my truck. It was something deeper, more powerful, like the sound of thunder rolling through the ground. The man took off running again, disappearing into the darkness. I tried to call after him, but my voice seemed to vanish in the sound. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Shadows stretched across the road, twisting and shifting almost like they were alive. They crept closer, and as they did, I felt a cold chill seep into my skin. I backed up, but the shadows kept coming, growing longer and darker, filling the road like a wave of black water. I ran back to my truck and jumped inside, slamming the door and locking it. I hit the gas, my tires screeching as I sped away. But in my rearview mirror, I saw the shadows following me, keeping pace with my truck. I pushed the pedal down harder, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows stayed with me, stretching out across the road like long, dark fingers reaching for me. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, speeding down the dark road. I could still see the shadows creeping along in my rearview mirror, like a moving wave of darkness chasing me down. They were faster than any shadows had a right to be, sliding over the asphalt, reaching for my truck as if they had a life of their own. The radio crackled again, the static loud and sharp. I reached over, hoping to turn it off, but a voice broke through, soft and haunting. "Hank," it whispered, just like before. I could barely make out the words, but they sent a shiver down my spine. "You can't escape." My heart pounded harder. How did it know my name? I forced my gaze back to the road, but it felt like something or someone was watching me from every corner of the truck, every shadowed part of the cab. I could almost feel the weight of it pressing down on me, filling up the small space until I could hardly breathe. I glanced back in the mirror again, and the shadows were gone. My hands were still trembling, but I let out a breath, hoping maybe it was over. But just as I started to calm down, a strange glow appeared up ahead. At first, it was faint, just a soft light on the horizon. But as I got closer, it grew brighter, stretching across the road like some kind of thick fog, glowing with an unnatural blue light. I slowed down, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The road was clear in front of me, but the glow was so intense that I could barely see anything beyond it. Then, in the middle of the road, I saw the hitchhiker again. He was standing there, staring at me with that same hollow look in his eyes, his hand stretched out like he was signaling me to stop. My first instinct was to slam on the brakes, but something stopped me. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to keep going, to get out of there as fast as I could. But the truck seemed to have a mind of its own. As I got closer, it slowed down, rolling to a stop just a few feet from the hitchhiker. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and glassy, like he was in a trance. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't leave me here." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I felt like I was frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. Then, before I could react, the hitchhiker reached up and placed his hand on the hood of my truck. The truck's engine died instantly. The silence that followed was almost deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and the faint rustling of the wind outside. The hitchhiker just stood there, his hand resting on the hood, his gaze fixed on me. Then, slowly, he turned his head, looking over his shoulder at something behind him. The shadows. They were back, creeping toward us from the sides of the road, sliding over the ground like a black tide. I wanted to start the engine, to drive away, but the truck wouldn't budge. It was like the whole thing was dead, just like the man standing in front of me. The hitchhiker looked at me, his face filled with terror. "They're coming for you too, Hank," he said, his voice shaking. "They always take the ones who stop." I didn't know what to say. My mouth was dry, my hands clenching the wheel so hard that my knuckles turned white. What are they?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, his eyes hollow and empty. "They were like us once, drivers, travelers, people who thought they could handle the road. But they stayed out here too long. They let the darkness in. Now they're part of it. And if you don't get out of here..." His voice trailed off, and he looked down at his own hands, almost like he was seeing them for the first time. I glanced at the ignition, praying the engine would start. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, but there was nothing, just silence. I looked back up at the hitchhiker, desperation clawing at me. "Help me," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Please." But the hitchhiker only shook his head. "It's too late for me," he said, his voice filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. "But maybe not for you." Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the shadows, his figure slowly fading into the darkness. I watched him go, feeling a strange emptiness settle over me. I wanted to call out to him, to beg him to come back, but something told me he was already gone. And that's when I heard it, the soft, scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. I looked up and saw them, the shadows. They were right in front of the truck, their dark, shifting forms pressing against the windows, blocking out the light. I could barely see through the darkness, but I could feel their presence, cold and heavy, pressing down on me, suffocating me. They wanted me. I could feel it in my bones, a deep primal fear that made my skin crawl. I didn't know what they were or where they had come from, but I knew one thing: I had to get out of there. With one last desperate attempt, I turned the key again. This time, the engine roared to life, filling the silence with its loud, comforting rumble. I didn't waste a second. I slammed my foot down on the gas, and the truck lurched forward, breaking free from the shadows. But as I drove, I could still feel them, their cold, dark presence lingering at the edges of my vision. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that they started to ache. The radio crackled again, but I didn't dare touch it. I knew what I'd hear if I did. "Hank," the voice whispered, soft and haunting. "We'll see you again." I kept driving, not daring to look back. The road stretched out in front of me, endless and dark, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. By the time I finally saw the lights of a small gas station up ahead, I was practically shaking. I pulled into the parking lot, cut the engine, and stumbled out of the truck, my legs barely holding me up. The gas station was empty, and the fluorescent lights cast a cold blue glow over the lot. But I didn't care. I was just grateful to be somewhere with light. I walked up to the counter, trying to steady my breathing. The clerk looked at me, his eyebrows raised. "You all right, buddy?" he asked, eyeing me with a mix of concern and confusion. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. All I could think about were the shadows, the voice, the way they had chased me down that dark, empty road. I felt like I was going to be sick. The clerk must have seen the look on my face, because he leaned over the counter, his voice low. "You drove the long dark, didn't you?" I barely able to keep myself from collapsing. The clerk shook his head, a look of pity in his eyes. "You're not the first, you know. There are others, truckers, travelers, people who thought they could handle it. Some of them made it out, but not all of them were whole after that. And some of them, well, they never made it out at all." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. What are they?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The clerk shrugged, his face grim. "No one really knows. Some say they're the souls of drivers who got lost out there, others say there's something darker. But one thing's for sure, they're always watching, waiting for the next one to stop." I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, too tired and too scared to ask any more questions. As I climbed back into my truck and drove away from the gas station, I could still feel the shadows lingering in the back of my mind. I knew I'd never drive that road again, but somehow I had a feeling it didn't matter. Because once you've seen the shadows on the long dark, they never really let you go. My name is Luke, and I've been a truck driver for most of my life. There's something peaceful about the open road, the long stretches of highway, the silence that comes with driving alone at night. But there are also times when the road can feel lonely, even eerie, especially when you find yourself in the middle of nowhere with nothing but darkness for miles. I've driven all kinds of routes, from city deliveries to cross-country hauls, but there's one route I'll never forget: Highway 16. It was a late autumn night when I took a job to haul a load of goods from one side of the state to the other. The pay was good, and the trip wasn't supposed to take more than a day or two. The route was mostly rural, winding through small towns and farmland. But the part that made me uneasy was the long stretch of Highway 16 that cut through the deep woods. It was a desolate road, known for being empty most of the time, with hardly any towns or gas stations for miles. I had driven that highway a couple of times before, and every time it felt strange, like the air was heavier, the trees pressing in on either side of the road like they were watching you. But I didn't think too much of it. A road's a road, and I had a job to do. The first part of the trip was easy enough. I left early in the evening, figuring I'd drive through the night and make good time. The weather was calm, just a little chilly as the season started to change. I had the radio playing softly, keeping me company as I cruised down the highway. By the time I reached Highway 16, it was well past midnight. The moon was high in the sky, casting a dim light over the empty road. The trees on either side were tall and thick, their branches reaching out like twisted arms. I turned off the radio, preferring the quiet as I settled in for the long stretch ahead. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. My headlights flickered for a moment, just a quick dimming before they went back to normal. I didn't think much of it, maybe a loose connection, or just the truck being temperamental. But then it happened again. This time, the lights dimmed for a few seconds before flickering back on. I checked my dashboard, but everything seemed fine. The truck was running smoothly, no signs of any issues. I made a mental note to get it checked when I reached the next town, but I kept driving. After all, I'd been on the road long enough to know that sometimes things just acted up for no reason. But the longer I drove, the worse it got. The headlights started flickering more often, and the temperature inside the cab seemed to drop. I turned up the heat, but it didn't help. The cold seemed to seep in from outside, chilling me to the bone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. It was dark, and the trees were casting long shadows across the road. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of it again, a figure standing by the side of the road, watching as I drove by. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my heart racing. There was no way anyone would be out here in the middle of the night. The nearest town was miles away, and there hadn't been another car on the road for hours. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was off. I kept driving, trying to focus on the road ahead. The headlights flickered again, and this time, when they came back on, I saw it, standing in the middle of the road, directly in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a stop just inches from the figure. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, frozen in place. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. He was tall, with long stringy hair that hung down over his face. His clothes were old and tattered, like he'd been wandering the woods for years. But what really unsettled me was the way he stood, completely still, not moving an inch, even as my headlights bathed him in light. I honked the horn, hoping he'd move, but he didn't react. He just stood there, staring at me through the windshield. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something wasn't right about this man. I had been on the road long enough to know when to trust my gut, and every instinct was telling me to get out of there. I shifted the truck into reverse, my hands shaking as I backed up slowly. The figure didn't move, didn't follow. He just stood there, watching me with those hollow eyes. I reversed until I was far enough away, then shifted back into drive and swerved around him, speeding down the road as fast as the truck would go. My heart was still racing, and I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see him standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching out into the darkness. For the next hour, I didn't see anything unusual. The headlights stopped flickering, and the cold inside the cab seemed to fade. I started to relax, telling myself it was just some drifter, maybe someone who had lost his way or was trying to hitch a ride. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something wrong with that man, something unnatural. It was almost 2 a.m. when I saw the gas station up ahead. It was one of those small, rundown places you only find in the middle of nowhere. The lights were on, but there were no other cars around, and the place looked deserted. Still, I figured I'd stop, stretch my legs, and maybe get a cup of coffee to shake off the nerves. I pulled into the parking lot and climbed out of the truck, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The place was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of the neon sign above the door. I walked inside, the bell above the door jingling as I entered. The gas station was just as empty as I'd expected. There was no one behind the counter, no customers in sight. The shelves were stocked with the usual snacks and drinks, but everything looked like it hadn't been touched in weeks. I walked up to the counter and rang the bell, but no one came. After a few minutes, I decided to help myself to some coffee. I figured whoever was working must have stepped out for a minute, and I'd leave the money on the counter. As I poured the coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The whole place felt abandoned, like it had been frozen in time, untouched by the outside world. Even the air inside felt stale, like it hadn't been breathed in for a long time. I took a sip of the coffee, but it was cold, like it had been sitting there for hours. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from the back of the store. I set the coffee down and turned toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was rhythmic, steady, like someone was knocking on wood. I took a step toward the back of the store, where a narrow hallway led to what I assumed was a storage room. The tapping grew louder as I approached, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something told me to turn around to get back in the truck and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know what was making that noise. I reached the end of the hallway, where a door stood slightly ajar. The tapping was coming from inside. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart in my throat. The room was dark, but I could make out the shape of a figure standing in the corner, its back to me. It was tall, its shoulders hunched, and it was tapping something against the wall, slow, deliberate taps. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure stopped tapping. For a moment there was silence, and then, slowly, the figure turned around. It was the man from the road. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and hollow. His clothes were the same, tattered and dirty, like he'd been wandering for years. But there was something else now, something darker. His skin was gray, almost translucent, and his mouth hung open in a twisted grin. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but I couldn't look away. He took a step toward me, his movements slow and unnatural, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. "Why didn't you stop?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. He took another step, his eyes locking onto mine. "I was waiting for you." I turned and ran, my legs barely carrying me as I sprinted back through the store. The tapping started again, louder now, echoing in my ears as I burst through the front door and into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the truck. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was far away from Highway 16. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. But I'll never drive that road again. Some roads are haunted, and Highway 16 is one of them. And whatever is out there, it's still waiting. I'm Jake, a long-haul trucker, and I've been on the road for years. I've driven through cities and towns, mountains and deserts, and everything in between. Most nights, I find comfort in the solitude of the open road. The hum of my big rig is like a lullaby, and the stars above serve as my guide. But there's one night I'll never forget, a night that changed everything. It was late in October, the kind of night when the wind howls and the moon is hidden behind thick clouds. I was on a long stretch of highway, far away from any town or city. The night was dark, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me. I had just finished a delivery and was heading back to my home base. As I drove, I sipped on my coffee, trying to keep my eyes open. The fatigue settled in like a heavy blanket, and I fought to stay alert. And the occasional sound of a passing car felt like a ghostly whisper. That's when I noticed it, a flickering light in the distance. My curiosity piqued, and I leaned forward, straining to see what it was. It looked like it was coming from an old gas station tucked away from the main road. I hadn't seen one for miles, and it was strange to see a light at this hour. I decided to take a detour. I turned off the highway and followed a narrow dirt road that led me deeper into the darkness. The flickering light grew brighter as I got closer, illuminating the surroundings with an eerie glow. The trees loomed large on either side, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just an old gas station. What could go wrong? As I pulled into the parking lot, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. The gas station looked abandoned, with cracked windows and weeds growing through the pavement. The flickering light came from a rusty sign that read, "Open all night." It was hard to believe that anyone would stop here, let alone that it was actually open. The cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I wrapped my arms around myself and approached the door. It creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the gas station was dark and dusty. The smell of mildew filled the air, and the shelves were lined with expired snacks and drinks, all covered in a thick layer of dust. It felt like stepping back in time. I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. There was a flickering fluorescent light overhead, casting strange shadows on the walls. I felt like I was being watched. The thought made my skin crawl, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I wandered further inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. That's when I heard it, a soft sound behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I was tired after all. I took a deep breath and continued exploring, hoping to find something interesting. In the station, I spotted an old cash register. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Next to it sat a dusty radio. I picked it up, and as soon as I turned the knob, it crackled to life. A haunting melody filled the room, sending chills down my spine. The music felt out of place in this decaying gas station. Colder, and I felt a shiver run through me. I turned to leave, but before I could, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest. I glanced around, my senses on high alert. The whispers began then, soft and unintelligible, filling the room and sending a wave of panic through me. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to move deeper into the gas station. I walked to the back room, where the cash register sat. As I approached, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, a shadowy silhouette standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face pale and expressionless, with long dark hair that hung in front of her eyes. Through me, and I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I felt frozen, caught between fight and flight. She took a step closer, and I could see the emptiness in her eyes. It was as if she was a ghost, a remnant of something that once was. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot. In her mouth, but no words came out. I felt a cold breeze wash over me, and it felt as though the shadows were closing in. Panic surged through my veins. I turned and dashed for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. I was trapped. I the woman, who stood still, watching me with her hollow eyes. My heart raced as I searched for a way out. I grabbed the doorknob, pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers echoed in my mind, drowning out my thoughts, and I felt the walls closing in on me. Another sound, a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from the shadows. I turned to see dark shapes moving along the walls, flickering in and out of view. I felt terror gripping my heart, as I realized I was not alone in this gas station. I was surrounded by something dark and malevolent. In a moment of sheer desperation, I pushed past the woman and ran toward the back window. I didn't know if it would open, but I had to try. I could feel her breath on my neck as I reached for the window, my hands trembling. I felt the shadows close in around me, threatening to swallow me whole. I managed to pry the window open, and without thinking, I squeezed through. I landed hard on the ground outside, scraping my arms against the rough edges. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I sprinted to my truck, my heart pounding in my chest. I jumped inside, slammed the door shut, and fumbled with the key. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, my tires kicking up dirt and gravel. I glanced back, but the gas station was already fading into the darkness behind me. I drove like a bat out of hell, not daring to slow down. The whispers haunted me, echoing in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't escape. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Each time I took a long haul, I felt a chill run down my spine whenever I passed that stretch of road. The moonlight would flicker in my rearview mirror, and I would hear the whispers, soft and insistent, reminding me of the gas station that was supposed to be open all night. I tried to put it behind me. I went back to my routine, hauling loads across the country. I talked to my fellow truckers, but none of them had ever heard of that gas station. They laughed at my story, dismissing it as a trick of fatigue or the product of too many late-night drives. But I knew what I had experienced. Months passed, but the memory haunted me. I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched or the sound of those whispers. It was like a dark cloud hanging over me, and I couldn't escape it. I became more cautious on the road, avoiding that stretch whenever I could. Then chilly night in early December, I found myself driving through that same desolate area again. The memory of the gas station came rushing back, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being silly. After all, it was just an old gas station. But as I drove, I noticed something strange. The flickering light was back. My heart raced as I recognized the familiar glow. I tried to tell myself to keep driving, but curiosity won out again. I turned off the highway and followed the dirt road once more, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight. As I approached the gas station, I felt a mix of fear and excitement. It looked the same as before, but there was something different about it. The sign that read "Open all night" now glowed steadily, the flickering gone. It seemed inviting, but I knew better. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my truck, the cold air hitting me hard. The gas station felt alive, like it was waiting for me to return. I walked toward the entrance, my heart pounding. The door creaked open, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The unchanged, dark, dusty, and filled with the stale smell of decay. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that danced on the walls. But as I moved deeper into the gas station, I noticed something new, a trail of footprints leading toward the back room. I followed the footprints, curiosity peaked despite the growing sense of dread. The whispers were quieter this time, like a distant echo. As I approached the back room, I saw something that made my heart stop, a figure standing at the cash register. It was the same woman I had seen before, but she looked different this time. Her hair was long and wild, and her eyes, those hollow eyes, were wide with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. She was staring at something on the counter, her expression unreadable. Hello, out, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned to me slowly, her gaze locking onto mine. The air grew colder, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice low and haunting. I didn't want to. I just wanted to see." My words trailed off as I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run. "See what?" she asked, taking a step toward me. "See the truth, or see the darkness?" "What are you talking about?" I managed to say, confusion and fear mixing inside me. She tilted her head, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something human in her eyes. "This place holds secrets, Jake. Secrets that bind me here. You felt it before, didn't you? The whispers, the shadows." I nodded, my throat dry. "Yes, I thought it was just my imagination." "It's not just your imagination. This gas station is a place of lost souls. Those who wander in rarely leave." She stepped closer, and I felt the temperature drop even more. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What happened here?" She glanced around as if ensuring we were alone. "Years ago, this place was a thriving stop for weary travelers. But one night, a terrible accident occurred. A truck driver lost control and crashed into the station. The explosion took lives, innocent lives." I felt a shiver run through me as she spoke. "And now the souls of those who died are trapped here, caught between this world and the next." "But why me?" I asked, my mind racing. "Why am I hearing the whispers? Why did you bring me back?" "I didn't bring you back," she replied, her voice filled with sorrow. "You chose to return. The gas station calls to those who have been touched by its darkness. You have a connection to this place, and it won't let you go." I backed away, feeling the panic rise within me. "I don't want to be here. I want to leave." "You can't leave until you understand," she said, her voice softening. "You must confront the darkness within yourself." "What darkness?" I shouted, frustration and fear overwhelming me. "Your fear, your regrets, your failures, they all bind you to this place. You are not just a trucker, Jake. You carry the weight of lost souls with you." She paused, and I could see the pain etched on her face. "I can help you, but you have to let me in." I shook my head, unable to process what she was saying. "I don't understand. How can you help me?" "By showing you the truth," she said. "But you have to trust me." I hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. "What if I refuse?" "Then you will be trapped here with me, bound to this gas station for eternity," she replied, her voice cold and distant. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "Okay, show me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'll trust you." As soon as the words left my lips, the room shifted. The walls seemed to dissolve, and I found myself standing in a different time, surrounded by a bustling gas station filled with people. I could hear laughter and the sounds of engines revving. It was a world alive with energy. But then, everything changed. The laughter turned to screams as a massive truck barreled down the road, its tires screeching against the pavement. I watched in horror as the truck driver lost control, swerving toward the gas station. Time slowed as the truck crashed into the building, the explosion illuminating the night sky. Flames engulfed the station, and I could see the faces of the people trapped inside, fear etched in their features as they struggled to escape. I turned to the woman beside me, but she was gone. Panic surged through me as I tried to process what I was witnessing. I felt the heat of the flames, the suffocating smoke filling my lungs. I stumbled back, desperately trying to escape the nightmare unfolding before me. Suddenly, I was back in the gas station, the woman standing before me once again. "Do you understand now?" she asked, her voice filled with urgency. "They died because of me," I realized, my voice trembling. "I didn't do anything to help." "You weren't there," she said softly. "But you carry their pain with you. It's time to let go." "How can I let go?" I asked, tears welling in my eyes. "I didn't even know them." "Forgive yourself," she replied. "You must forgive yourself, or you will remain bound to this place forever." I felt the weight of her words sink in, and for the first time, I understood the darkness I had been carrying. The guilt and regret that haunted me, the feeling that I hadn't done enough. These were the chains that kept me tethered to the gas station. "I forgive you," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I forgive you all." As the words left my lips, I felt a warmth spread through me. The shadows that had clung to me began to fade, and the whispers grew quieter. The gas station felt less oppressive, and I could finally breathe. The woman smiled, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "You're free now. You can leave this place behind." I turned to the door, ready to escape the horrors of the gas station once and for all. As I stepped outside, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The cold air felt refreshing, and I took a deep breath, grateful to be alive. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove away from the gas station. I didn't look back. I felt lighter than I had in years. The burden of guilt finally lifted. The road stretched ahead of me, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. From that night on, I continued my journeys as a trucker, but I never forgot the gas station and the woman who had shown me the truth. I carried the memory of the lost souls with me, but instead of guilt, I felt a sense of purpose. I vowed to honor their memory by living my life to the fullest. The lonely road was no longer just a path to drive. It was a journey of healing, a chance to make a difference in the world. And though the shadows may still linger in the corners of my mind, I knew I was no longer alone. The gas station would always be a part of me, but it no longer held me captive. With every mile I traveled, I felt the freedom of the open road, the beauty of the night sky, and the whispers of the lost souls guiding me toward my destiny. My name is Dale. I've been a truck driver for years, but one October night changed everything. I was hauling electronics through a lonely stretch of highway in Wyoming when I spotted an old, flickering sign. "Last chance stop." Low on fuel, I pulled in. The truck stop was eerie. Only one other truck sat outside, dark and silent. Inside, the convenience store felt freezing, and the lights buzzed overhead. I saw no one behind the counter, but I heard a faint whisper. "Dale." My heart skipped. How did anyone know my name? I called out, but only silence replied. Then, From the back of the store, I caught a glimpse of someone, tall, thin, their face hidden in shadow. They whispered my name again, dragging it out, like a breath escaping into the night. Panicked, I backed out and hurried to my truck. The other truck's door was now open, empty, yet a pair of muddy footprints led toward my rig. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped off without refueling. As I drove away, the voice still echoed in my ears, whispering my name over the hum of the engine, a reminder that some roads hold secrets you're better off never knowing.